So I'm going to say, and we're live, but I guess you guys have been hearing me for a minute now. So that's rather frustrating. Regardless, tonight I've got on Blue and Butternut, and we're going to jump into the Iron Brigade. Issue being with the Iron Brigade, that's going to be some of the Union forces that were fighting during the American Civil War, or maybe more aptly called the War of Northern Aggression, or whatever regional colloquialism you would like to employ. Having said that, we as Americans, as English ancestral lineage, as Albion seed, or however you want to phrase it, we've recognized, and now I'm being told that people can't hear me. This is very interesting, gentlemen. So let me break this monologue. Can you hear me? Put a one in the chat if you guys can hear me and this is coming through correctly.
I have the stream up. I can hear you on the stream.
All right, good. Well, yeah, we're going to leave that for just a second. We'll see what happens. I know there is about a 30-second delay, but frustrating. I would love to know what's going on right now with Restream. All right, so I've got a one in the chat. Well, we're just going to roll with it then. Hopefully, I didn't put my foot in my mouth back when we weren't supposed to be live, but apparently we were. All right. Well, I'll jump back into the monologue just to say whether it's the Vermont, whether it's the Navajo, whether it's various tribal nations here in the U.S., we've had a long history of recognizing those that were good with war, capable in their martial abilities, and that we had to recognize as a foe that had to be recognized as someone who could give us punch for punch. Hopefully that's what I found tonight, and that's what Blue and Butternut is going to get a hold of and explain to us. So while we're at it, let me introduce you, Mr. Blue and Butternut. How are you doing? Go ahead and introduce us to yourself, what it is you do, and where we're going to head tonight.
All right. Hello. I'm Blue and Butternut. I've ran a Twitter page for a while now, mostly discussing the Civil War. I've been interested in Civil War history since I was about 16, but before that, I was mostly interested in World War II and stuff like that. And I have ancestors who fought on both sides of the Civil War. And I'm from the Midwest. So, up here, and I'm from an area where some men of a
You
specific.
bastard.
Yeah, well, well, where some men were enlisted in the 24th Michigan Infantry. I'm from Michigan. And, there's a few buried here. And both of the ones who are buried in my home area, my two hometowns that I live near, were both wounded at Gettysburg severely. Which will be a common theme you'll see, I think, with the Iron Brigade. So I think tonight we'll get into the history of the Iron Brigade and talk a little bit about how they were formed and where these men came from and some of their battles in history. So I think that's a good place to start with that.
Very good, very good. All right, so you're up in Michigan. Just to sort of paint a picture for us, you started getting into the Civil War when you were about 16. What caught your eye? What it's very easy when somebody's coming from the South to still see that all around. What is it up north, especially in the Great Lakes region, that caught your eye and said, "Hey, this is worth investigating and digging into"?
Well, I think what it was, I was into line battles a little bit, like Napoleonic Wars, but what it was, I think specifically, was watching the movie Gettysburg, kind of hearing, because at that time the Civil War was kind of becoming popular, or not necessarily popular, but controversial in the media. But I started looking into it for myself, reading a lot about the battles and stuff. And I grew a great respect for these men. And I think that the thing that struck me different about Civil War than did the Napoleonic Wars or World War II was the fact that it was all fought on this continent here. And I have a fair amount of ancestors who fought in it, even if my family didn't even really realize that. The only ancestor of mine that actually my family knew about that fought in the Civil War was a man who was from Germany, moved here. He moved to Ohio, but in the 1850s, he began working on the Mississippi River on a riverboat. And in 1861, he happened to find himself in New Orleans and enlisted in the Confederate Army in New Orleans. Um, and so, actually, it's kind of weird, but yeah, most Midwesterners I think you talk to will have ancestors who fought on both sides. But I think that's kind of what got me into it.
Sure. Well, and it's one of the things for the people that grew up outside of the Great Lakes region. I think what they don't realize is post Civil War, the various movements of peoples up into the Midwest coming out of the South as well. Unfortunately, that area was devastated, and so there were some that were able to hold on and to keep a place out there, but then there were also that relocated, due to economic issues and trying to figure out something that could continue to put food on the table after all that had washed out.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. A lot of Southerners moved up here, including some of my ancestors who were originally from Virginia and North Carolina.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Well, very good. All right. So paint the picture for us. The Civil War is happening. It's a done deal. We've already had a few battles at this point, and the West, as it was known at that point, says, "Hey, we need to start building some regiments, start figuring out how we're going to join in." What was that? What took place? Who were the major players?
Okay, so um, in around April, just after Fort Sumter, so actually just after Fort Sumter, the state of Wisconsin, and that's where we're going to start here, is with the state of Wisconsin. They began raising troops for the Union Army, and of the regiments that Wisconsin raised, the one that I'm going to focus on here is going to be the Second Wisconsin Infantry, one of the key members of the Iron Brigade, because they were the only regiment of the Iron Brigade to see combat at the First Battle of Manassas. Um, and that's kind of a key moment for these men. And as we get into some of their later battles, we'll want to kind of look back to Manassas. But at the First Battle of Manassas, the second Wisconsin was part of William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade, and they um, were also in the same brigade with the 69th New York Infantry, who's famous Irish brigade. Um, and at the first Battle of Manassas, they got their first baptism of fire when they um, attacked the Confederates at Henry House Hill, the Stonewall Brigade. They faced the Stonewall Brigade, and this wouldn't be the first time they'd actually faced the Stonewall Brigade directly in combat. They faced Stonewall Jackson's brigade, and they were repulsed under bloody fire. And it was a humiliating moment for these men. And their regimental commander, who his name was, let me see, what was his name again? Here was Park Coon. That was it. Park Coon. That was his name. And well, he was disgraced for some of his actions, and so was the lieutenant colonel of the regiment. And it was a humiliating moment for them. And so after Manassas, these men kind of had a chip on their shoulder. They wanted to prove something, and they would later. But on the other regiments, there were a couple other regiments that were raised at this point. The Sixth Wisconsin and the Seventh
Which
Wisconsin.
is, I want to jump in real quick, just because if I remember correctly, it was the sixth that was primarily the German element within the Iron Brigade. But this was not a bunch of 48ers. This was primarily Irish and Midwestern Anglos. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of them would have been Anglos. The Sixth Wisconsin. If I'm trying to let me remember who it was who it was who originally mustered them into service. It would have been the Lysander Cutler. That's right. And actually, quite a few of those men um, were from Michigan, believe it or not.
Okay.
But yeah, so There were, I'm sure there were some Germans in it, but most of them were Anglos, actually.
Yes.
Um, yeah, there's kind of a myth about some of these regiments, especially the Midwestern regiments, that they were primarily Germans. Actually, most of the German regiments, I think, originated from New York in New England.
From New York, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Um, yep. And so then you had both the which ones were it? There were a couple that left the battlefield disgraced, but then there was also, I believe, it was the 24th New York, the German rifles, that did well. But
Manassas.
uh I don't remember off the top of my head.
Oh, well, the second Wisconsin, after they were driven back, they formed up a line with, I think it was the 13th New York. And
Okay. Oh, okay. So back to Manassas is what we're talking about. Gotcha.
yeah, just a little bit
Yeah,
on
yeah.
Manassas, because I kind of wanted to give a picture. I'm not going to stick too long on that. The only reason I brought it up is because it's important for the second Wisconsin, because the second Wisconsin, like I
Yes.
said, is one of the key regiments of the brigade. It's the first one. It's the first regiment that would be raised in the brigade. The other two, starting out from Wisconsin, were the sixth and seventh Wisconsin. The sixth Wisconsin was mustered into service just before Manassas, but they, of course, weren't at Manassas. And the seventh was mustered in September of 1861. The other regiment was the 19th Indiana, and they were um, led by, and this is a man that'll come in important later, Solomon Meredith.
Okay.
Um, he was a North Carolinian, actually. Actually,
Hmm.
believe it or not, there were quite a few North Carolinians involved in the Iron Brigade. Another one was Edward Bragg, also part of the 19th Indiana.
Yeah.
Uh, um, they were there were a lot of North Carolinians involved, um, and a couple of Virginians. But um, the 19th Indiana was mustered into service just after Manassas on July 29th, and um, they would the brigade isn't really formed until early 62, early 1862, and they're formed into this brigade of four regiments. Actually, the original plan by the governor of Wisconsin was he wanted them to be an all Wisconsin regiment, and the idea was to put the fifth Wisconsin infantry in there, but for a variety of reasons, the fifth Wisconsin would not participate in formation of this brigade, and instead it would be the 19th Indiana, which kind of rubbed some Wisconsin politicians the wrong way, but overall was probably better for brigade cohesion anyway.
Yeah.
But so the
So
brigade. Go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yep.
The brigade is formed in early 1862, um, and they're put under command of a man named John Gibbon. And it's John Gibbon who gives them their, and he's also a North Carolinian, um, and he actually has two brothers in the Confederate Army. Um, two brothers, and there's a few funny stories about him, and I'll get into those in a little bit. But John Gibbon is the one who really gives the Iron Brigade its identity. I mean,
Hmm.
he's the one who gives them the distinct black hats.
Now, was he the one that had been teaching at West Point prior to the war?
He was an artillerist though.
Okay.
He had no experience with infantry
Okay.
uh, command before the war, so he was mainly an artillerist, but in the fourth U.S. Artillery.
Okay.
So he was new to infantry drill, and he kind of wanted to prove himself uh, as being good with infantry by specifically well drilling this brigade that he's given command of, and he also wanted to make his brigade very distinct. And in fact, what he really wanted to do with this brigade was he wanted to make them on par with the regular regiments of the U.S. Army. And
Mm.
so he gave them essentially what would have been a pre-war regular army uniform. He gave them the 1858 party hats, the white leg gaiters, and the full frock coats. Um, he gave them a very distinct kind of prim and prime a look that a lot of it kind of gave this brigade a lot of pride, and he regularly, extensively drilled them. Um, Probably gave them more drilling than any other regiment in the Union Army. Um, so um, he would lead the brigade at its first real engagement, which I'll get into in a few. But I'll let you talk for a second.
Yeah, well, I don't have too much to say. I do think it's interesting. One of the things that caught my eye a few weeks ago, not that it deals directly with the brigade in its historical sense, but I think it might have been Waltz that was citing about how hard the Minnesotans fought and what had gone on. And I cannot remember if he referenced the Black Hats or if somebody else did, but there was no Minnesotan element within the Iron Brigade.
No,
And so it's kind of interesting the various states that took part within there and how they formed up the various units that would make up the brigade because it was exclusively Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan.
yeah. Now later, after Gettysburg, there was an attempt to add a Pennsylvania regiment to the
Sure.
brigade. That the men of the brigade did not consider those men to be part of it. They
Right.
viewed those men with disdain. But
Well, and to not bury the lead, once we get into Gettysburg and talk about that, gentlemen, if I remember correctly, the losses were nearly 75%.
oh yeah, yeah, it was devastating. But I won't get too much into that yet. I think we should wait a
Okay.
little bit to get into Gettysburg. I think instead going forward, so putting a kind of a in around July 1862, okay? Because at this point in the war, the Iron Brigade, again, has not seen combat. They have not been attached to the main source of fighting in the Eastern Theater, which was the Army of the Potomac, which had at that point been driven off the Virginia Peninsula by Robert E. Lee's army. They were now on the retreat back up to Washington, D.C., and this left Robert E. Lee with the plan and the ability to march north to concentrate his army against the Army of Virginia, commanded by John Pope, Union General John Pope. Um, the Iron Brigade, it just so happened, was led. It was part of the First Corps, commanded by Irvin McDowell, and more specifically under Rufus King's division. Rufus King is kind of an interesting character. After the war, he would become a U.S. diplomat,
Hmm.
but he had a lot of health issues. We'll get into that in a few. But so um, around June, around August of 1862, Lee is moving northward into northern Virginia, and he meets Pope's army along the Rappahannock River, and he's unable to defeat Pope's army or get any kind of breakthrough there. So he sends Stonewall Jackson's wing of the army around towards Manassas, around Pope's army in the rear, raiding supply lines and stuff like that at Manassas Junction. Um, Skipping a little bit ahead, on August 28th, 1862, Jackson's men were encamped around a little farm near Groveton, Virginia, just off the old Manassas battlefield, off of Stony Ridge. Um, and they were encamped there, and um, McDowell's corps was moving eastward towards Centerville, along the road, and they did not know that Stonewall Jackson was encamped at the Bronner Farm. And that's what I was trying to get at, the Bronner Farm. Uh, Jackson's men were encamped there, and Jackson was planning on giving battle to Pope at this point. And so, seeing the Federal columns on the road there, he decided to order his men forward against what would have been Abner Doubleday's brigade, all of Rufus King's division that was marching along the road there, which included Abner Doubleday's brigade and Gibbon's brigade, the two that I'll be talking about here. So, um, this is around evening, around 6 o'clock. These Federals who are marching in what is called route step, essentially slowly, kind of sloppily. They're not really paying any mind because they don't really expect any kind of battle at this point. They come under artillery fire. And John Gibbon, who is, again, an experienced artillerist, immediately retreats from his column and goes towards the 4th United States Battery, his old battery, in fact, which is delivering counter battery fire to the rebels up on Bronner's farm. So, this kind of leaves the Federals in a kind of awkward position because they're sitting on the road in column, and they're ducking down from this artillery fire. Not particularly accurate artillery fire, but still artillery fire nonetheless. And so what Gibbon does is he orders the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, the old one from Manassas, 1st Manassas, the only one with combat experience, to get off the road, go into a little patch of woods, and then try and outflank this artillery battery that's firing down on the Federals. And so they deploy into line of battle outside of this little patch of woods, and they move forward. And when they move forward, and they get up there to the place where this artillery battery once was. Now it had escaped. It had gotten out before they could get there. Once they get out there, they see below them, because they're kind of on a little patch of high ground, they see just down a little bit below them the entirety of the Stonewall Brigade under William Baylor at this point, deploying in a line of battle. And so as soon as they see this, they begin wildly firing down. But the Stonewall Brigade comes up, and the Wisconsinites, they fire one volley. The Stonewall Brigade is completely unaffected, and this is actually something I noticed a lot when reading about the Iron Brigade. It's just how when you see these two veteran brigades going at each other, they have such a limited reaction to these volleys. Like typically, with most regiments, most brigades in the war, when you receive a volley, especially a very accurate one at close range, it's devastating to morale. It might not completely shatter a regiment, but it might come close. But not with these elite brigades and elite regiments like the Iron Brigade or the Stonewall Brigade. And so it's these two titans kind of coming to bear at each other in this field. The 2nd Wisconsin, who wanted revenge or to kind of redeem themselves following their humiliation at the Battle of Manassas in July of 61. They begin firing at Baylor's brigade. Baylor's men continue advancing, and the Wisconsin men are about outnumbered double. The Stonewall Brigade at this point numbered about 800 men. This Wisconsin regiment numbered about 400. So Gibbon, in response, orders forward the 19th Indiana that comes up next. And they go into battle just next to the 2nd Wisconsin. And together they fight against more rebels start coming up, the Georgians of Lawton's brigade, and they're going to come important later at the Battle of Antietam. They come up onto the field and start trying to outflank the Federals. In response, Gibbon commits his two other regiments, the the 7th and the 6th Wisconsin, and they go through the same woods that the 2nd had originally pushed that artillery battery out from. This fight goes on for a couple of hours in the dark, and it's quite devastating for both sides. But it was an opportunity for these men, especially the Wisconsin men, second Wisconsin men, to prove that they weren't cowards, to prove that they weren't the same regiment that ran in Manassas. And they did so pretty well, standing firmly against the Stonewall Brigade. And again, it wouldn't be the first time, and it wouldn't be the last time they would fight the Stonewall Brigade directly in battle. Um, but slowly, the firing died down after an intense couple hours, neither side making any advancement against each other. That's partially because Jackson made a couple mistakes here in kind of deploying his brigades piecemeal. Um, Jackson was definitely a great general, but this perhaps wasn't his best showing during the war. Um, yeah, there's other reasons why, though. He couldn't really deploy all of Ewell's division because part of his division was kind of on the other side of the battlefield. That night, Jackson would retreat up to the Stony Ridge, and Pope's army would for the next 2 days fight Jackson up there, only to be driven back across the Bull Run after Longstreet's corps arrived. Originally, it was Pope's plan to keep Jackson and Longstreet's wings from the army in Northern Virginia from beating each other, but he failed at that because Pope was probably one of the most incompetent generals of the war. But yeah, so that's kind of their first engagement at Bronner's Farm, and that's kind of one of the pivotal ones. It's probably, other than the next one we're going to talk about, their most important action in proving who they were during the war.
All right, so they've established themselves as a viable unit at this point. At this point, have they received the Iron Brigade moniker?
No, nope, that wouldn't come until September of the same year. Yeah, the Iron Brigade was far from, you know, having any kind of peace in this summer, summer 1862, one of the bloodiest periods of the war. Um, After the Second Battle of Manassas, Robert E. Lee's army now had the initiative. John Pope's army of Virginia was completely dissolved. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. When the Iron Brigade went into action at the beginning, very beginning of the battle, Rufus King, who commanded the division that the Iron Brigade was under, he had an epileptic seizure at the beginning of the battle, so he was replaced immediately with division command, and the division was given to Abner Doubleday. Um, yeah, that man had a lot of health issues. It wasn't his fault necessarily, although I don't think he should have, knowing his health issues, been in command of anything. But yeah, he had an epileptic seizure at the very beginning of the battle, and he was replaced. So Abner Doubleday now commanded this division. Irvin McDowell was also ousted from command of that corps of the army, having proven himself at both battles of Manassas to be less than capable of command, and he was replaced by Joseph Hooker. So Lee's army entered Maryland in early September 1862 with the intention of perhaps bringing in recruits to the Confederate Army from the state, and also perhaps even compelling the state to secede from the Union. Kind of a tall task, but also it would give Virginia farmers time to replenish their crops back home. So Lee begins his march northward. It's now up to George B. McClellan, who commands the Army of the Potomac, to defeat Lee's attempted invasion. The Army of Virginia, which the Iron Brigade had previously been a part of, was dissolved, and all of those units that were a part of it were consolidated into the Army of the Potomac. On September 13th, 1862, George McClellan or his staff received a a letter, which was essentially the entire uh, dispositions and where all the sections of the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia were around Maryland. Um, and so McClellan was now going to race to try and split the Army of Northern Virginia in two, preventing the two wings from consolidating. But the first part of that would be going up South Mountain in South Mountain Gap, which would lead towards the Potomac. But Jackson's wing of the army was down at Harper's Ferry, sieging there, and Longstreet's wing was north at Hagerstown. So on September the 14th, the Federals set out, the three Federal Corps, Reno's, Hooker's, and Burnside's Corps, set out for a gap in South Mountain known as Turner's Gap. And that gap was held by D.H. Hill's division of Longstreet's Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee didn't think that McClellan would try and cross South Mountain, but he did leave some troops there to make sure that if they did, it wouldn't be easy for them. So on the morning of September 14th, the Federals set out. Uh, Reno's Corps begins engaging early that morning. Hooker and Burnside's Corps soon engage, but they are unable to drive D.H. Hill's division off of South Mountain. And imagine attacking up a sharp hill like this wasn't very easy. So throughout the day, the fighting continued. Towards the end of the day, Gibbon's brigade arrived, and they were set up the National Road, just up the road, and given orders by either Burnside or Hooker to advance up the National Road straight into the Confederate center. This was kind of to act as a diversionary attack while Burnside and the rest of Hooker's corps pushed on the rebel flanks. And so the Iron Brigade began its ascension up South Mountain, and they did so under heavy fire from skirmishers on their flanks and in front of them. And they get up about 40 yards in front of the Confederate line, and they begin firing. And it's at this point, this is where the famous quote, what is it, that McClellan is watching this all occur. He's watching the Iron Brigade make this attack up the hill. And McClellan makes a comment to Joe Hooker where he says, those men must be made of iron, after inquiring who those men attacking up the National Road were. And that's where they get their nicknames from, apparently George B. McClellan saying that.
And this, so for anybody listening, guys who have been in the military will tell you, once a name is established, that is a moniker that you carry with you and that you live up to. And so these are not necessarily routine things to happen. These are out of the ordinary. And once that name is given, that is a piece of the heart and morale of a particular unit, be it a brigade, a regiment, battalion, whatever.
Oh yeah, of course, the same sort of story with the Stonewall Brigade. How they got their nickname. They have a very similar sort of origin story with that. And the fight at the National Road there was particularly intense. They faced I think it was a brigade of Georgians. Actually, though, I will say one thing about the D.H. Hill. This was something I was going to mention earlier. So it was D.H. Hill's division that was defending the National Road at Turner's Gap. D.H. Hill was actually a close personal friend of John Gibbons. They were both North Carolinians, and D.H. Hill The best man at D.H. Hill's wedding was John Gibbon. So, kind of going into this sort of a brother war thing. I mean, definitely a friend versus friend here.
Yeah.
At
It
this,
it is amazing. You go to a state like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and it very much is that brother versus brother. But then you take a step back and you look at the various commanders, and I mean, Custer's taking a picture of his buddy from West Point. You know, Custer on the Union side and his buddy down there on the Confederate side.
oh
It
yeah,
it is a nasty, brutal war. You know, if you listen to the rumors of the Prussian observers, it was just a continual slugfest. But you know, perhaps they didn't say that. But regardless, in the midst of this, there's still occasion where you'll find the various commanders, you know, asking each other, "How are you doing today?"
oh yeah, and I mean, in this war, and despite what perhaps some modern interpretations of it might be from certain people, oh yes, I mean these men, and they really didn't have a scorn for each other. I noticed reading a lot about the Iron Brigade that there were a lot of comments from both sides. The Iron Brigade, when they faced the Stonewall Brigade in battle, they wrote some very they would say, I mean, these are some fierce men. These are some admirable enemies, and the Confederates would write the very same about them. I mean, there was no, I think, more respected brigade in either army uh, than for the Confederates, the Stonewall Brigade, and for the Union, the Iron Brigade. Um,
Which is so. Let's just pontificate here for a second. What do you think it was about these Midwestern men that gave them the ability to claim that moniker and to act in such a way that they could gain the respect of their southern foes or compatriots, however you want to phrase it?
well, I mean, perhaps, I mean, they had similar backgrounds. I mean, these are all farm boys for the most part, and the same is true of a lot of
Yes.
these Southern soldiers. They're all farm boys or ruralites, I guess you could say. Um, you know, I noticed a lot about especially the Michiganders. Actually, half of the 24th Michigan regiment that was later added to the brigade, about half of them were New York born, but they moved to Michigan, where at that point most of the industry in Michigan would have been lumber, and so a lot of these guys were lumberjacks, and a lot of them were farmers and stuff. So they kind of already had a tough, um, you know, spirit about themselves from their labor. Uh, so they had that going for them, perhaps. For the Stonewall Brigade, especially them, they had a united sense of, well, they were all Virginians, and for the Iron Brigade, it was, well, we're all Midwesterners, and that's our common sort of
Yes.
binding thing that we have.
There was also an element of frontier still in the Midwest, and so we look at it now, and it seems kind of odd. But one of the things that you have to remember before the country was fully out there all the way into California, before various trade avenues amongst the Great Lakes, and then what would ultimately be the Ohio Erie Canal, and different things going on the Ohio River and the Mississippi. This is still the frontier, even more so to some degree than Alabama and Arkansas. You know, up north, they are dealing with the cold. They're dealing with the Great Lakes. They're dealing, like you said, it's primarily lumber right now in the area, and so it's lumberjacks and farmers. Because I believe I might be off on this, but I think Minnesota might have still either been in the middle of a Homestead Act or had yet to apply one when the brigade was formed. I might be off on that though by a couple decades. I can't remember.
Well, remember, Minnesota in the middle of the Civil War went through perhaps the largest Indian rebellion of the 1800s. when they had the Dakota War, when a bunch of Sioux Indians raided through the state, took a lot of hostages, and murdered a lot of people in the state of Minnesota. So, the state of Minnesota was essentially still the frontier at this point. Even
Right.
though it was granted statehood, it was still the frontier to a large degree. Um,
So we there's a viewer, Midwit Middleton Whitaker. He's in here and he asks. He says, "Serious question. Save for Armageddon and everything leading up to it. What war qualifies as anything but a brother war?"
um, well, I would say, I mean, when we talk about, I think specifically the Civil War, right? The reason we use that term in regards to the Civil War is because, well, it was Americans fighting Americans.
Hmm.
Now, when people apply that perhaps to, I don't know, like say the Napoleonic Wars, Germans fighting Anglos, it's not really the same. Um, you know, they're both white and they're both, from the same continent, but they're not the same culture. The
Yeah.
thing about the Civil War is, I mean, these people were literally of the same culture, in a lot of cases, friends and, well, tragically, even relatives. Um, speaking from my own family, I have a distant relation to a family. Um, One of them enlisted in a West Virginia Unionist militia regiment, and his two brothers enlisted. One of them enlisted, I think, it was the 63rd Virginia Mounted Infantry, and was killed at the Battle in the Market. The other one was enlisted in the 27th Virginia Infantry and killed at Manassas, second. So, um, I think that's kind of the difference, right?
Sure.
Is because of that.
So let's here for just a second. Let's dig into the idea of this being an English war to some degree, or an Anglo is maybe a better way of phrasing it. So my understanding is that at its height, the German troops, so to speak, within the U.S. Civil War was no greater than 25%. Now, to get to that 25% number, I also want to stress that that's including uh, second generation second generation German ethnics, as well as German born in Germany, born in the Rhine or various parts of Prussia or whatever, um, coming over. Well, anyways, you see what I'm saying. So potentially, depending on how you're counting, you could even get to Custer being a German soldier, which just goes to demonstrate that yes, there was an element. There was certainly a German element that was here prior to the Civil War. However, this was not the great ethnic struggle that it's sometimes painted out to be. Or do you think I'm painting with too broad a brush at the moment?
Well, I would say, at that point, going back to the American Revolution, well, you already had Germans settling in America at that point. You had the Pennsylvania Dutch and other
Sure.
German groups that have been here for a long time already. So I think it's maybe. I think a lot of people maybe when they talk about the immigration waves of the 1860s
Right.
and prior, maybe they're a little unfair to those people because this isn't like the waves of Italians and such that came in the early 1900s. These are more, they're Germanic, uh, you know, close to Anglos, I guess you could say.
Right.
Um, but
I guess if anything, there is a kernel of truth to the different things, to the different antagonistic things that are said on various sides. But that's sort of the gist of it at this time in American history is it's all a kernel, and yeah, we'll leave it at that because otherwise I'll get bogged down in the weeds.
yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah, but I think I agree though broadly that I think casting the
The,
Civil War as an ethnic conflict is a little.
right. It is primarily intra-ethnic rather than inter-ethnic at this point.
Yeah, but I guess kind of going back to the Iron Brigade, we covered South Mountain, a little bit about that. Because that's where they get their name. And John Gibbon, he wrote after the battle to his wife saying that everyone in the army looked to his regiment as being the best of the best. They were the best men, and he was so proud of that that he wrote quite a
Oh,
quite a
just
bit of.
imagine. I
Yeah,
mean, your chest is growing by 2 and 3 sizes.
yeah, because of these gallant actions that quite. I mean, nobody had quite seen bravery like this, I suppose, in the Union Army at this point. There was a lot of. I mean, there were other regiments, of course, that had done very gallant things. Dure Zouaves, for example, and the Irish Brigade regiments. But the Iron Brigade kind of stood as a pinnacle of what to be, because especially the fact that they tried to uh, attain themselves or tried to achieve regular army standards. But moving forward, after the Battle of South Mountain, Lee consolidated his army across the Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland, with his back to the Potomac River. And on September the 16th, McClellan followed and pursued him. And that day, he sent Joe Hooker's corps a little to the north to cross the Antietam and to get on Lee's flank. Um, oh, I just saw a comment. Anyway, um, so that evening,
Well
the
played,
men,
sir. Well played.
yeah, that evening, the men of the Iron Brigade would have went to sleep under a small drizzly rain. Not a very good night's sleep they had. And the next morning, they marched out towards a little cornfield known as part of the Miller's Farm, the Miller's Cornfield, which on each side there were two patches of woods, the West Woods and the East Woods. And well, they marched out that morning, and this would be the first major battle that they would participate in fully. Um, they marched into the cornfield that morning, and on the other side of the cornfield, in front of them was a brigade of Georgians, and that brigade of Georgians happened to be the same brigade that they faced at the Bronner Farm, and they got into line, the Georgians, I mean. And as soon as they saw that it was the Black Hats, the Black Hats that they had faced at the Bronner Farm, they wanted a little bit of revenge, and so they quickly formed a line and started delivering volleys, devastating volleys. But once again, the Iron Brigade, they marched forward. They did not flinch. These men wouldn't hesitate, and they didn't flinch when taking volleys. But as they reached the southern end of the cornfield, the 6th Wisconsin started taking flanking fire off the cornfield towards the West Woods. That brigade that was giving the flanking fire was the Stonewall Brigade again. So this would be depending on how you consider it, it would be the third time that the Stonewall Brigade would face the Iron Brigade or elements of it. And so, in response, John Gibbon ordered two of his regiments, the 7th Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana, across the Hagerstown Pipe and towards into the West Woods. Sweeping through the West Woods, they caught the Stonewall Brigade off guard and delivered a few devastating volleys to them, which made them break and run. This was the first time, I think, during the war that the Stonewall Brigade had ever been routed. So they actually, I mean, it was quite surprising. It was quite a shocking thing to actually be able to rout the Stonewall Brigade, and that was something that the men of the Iron Brigade were quite proud of themselves as again. But just about as soon as they had done that, John Bell Hood's division arrived nearby and began deploying in line of battle. And his Texas Brigade pushed into the cornfield and quickly drove the Iron Brigade out. So I guess they had the favor sort of returned to them. But both sides showed very, very, very. I mean, they showed that they were made of. They showed their mettle, so to speak, in those cornfields. The Stonewall Brigade stood some pretty devastating volleys, and so did the Texans. I mean, the Texas Brigade. That's another one that when you talk about famous brigades of the Civil War, the Texas Brigade does very commonly come up. Um, and those were some very tough men. Uh, but that would put the Iron Brigade out of action for the rest of the day. So that section of the battlefield kind of went into a bit of a lull, especially for Hooker's Corps, and that would be the end of the Battle of Antietam for them. But at the Battle of Antietam, they I'm going to try and remember the casualty statistics because I wrote it down here specifically for this. For Antietam, it would have been. They had suffered, I think, well, I cannot seem to find what I wrote down now.
It was a mass casualty event.
Oh yeah, I guess you could say that. Oh well, can't find the number exactly, but I think of the um, 1,800 men that they had, they suffered like I think about 600 casualties at Antietam. Um,
Massive, absolutely massive.
yeah. So, but that wouldn't be the last time that well that gets us into going into the next year because that would be the last major battle that the Iron Brigade would participate in
Uh-oh.
1862. So they did engage a bit at Fredericksburg, but not really enough to really warrant going into detail about it. So in the early months of 1863, um, the Iron Brigade would undergo a massive reorganization. John Gibbon was promoted to a division command, so he would no longer have command of the brigade, and it was given to instead the regimental commander of the 19th Indiana, Solomon Meredith, North Carolinian. Um, and well, he had a few problems with a few people in the army. Uh, After the Battle of South Mountain, he declared himself incapable of command and relieved himself from the army, so he was not present at the Battle of Antietam, which caught the scorn of John Gibbon. And also, Abner Doubleday did not particularly like him either. So he was not looked at particularly fondly in the army. So, um, but he would take brigade command regardless. And also, the Iron Brigade would be getting a new regiment added to it, the 24th Michigan, which was a welcome addition to the Army, um, considering that, or welcome addition to the brigade, I mean, considering the casualties they had suffered at Antietam. Um, so, going into 1863, they weren't at Chancellorsville, or not engaged at Chancellorsville, rather. So we kind of skip over a big period of time here until we get to the invasion of Pennsylvania. Um, and the invasion of Pennsylvania by Robert E. Lee's Army, Northern Virginia. By this point, the Army of the Potomac was commanded by Joe Hooker, although he would be quickly replaced by George Meade just before the Battle of Gettysburg. The Army of the Potomac was in pursuit of Lee's army northward. And on June 30th, 1863, John Buford's cavalry uh, had spotted at the town of Gettysburg elements of A.P. Hill's corps. Uh, so Buford, kind of getting the idea that the Confederates were planning on concentrating in that area, decided to deploy his men forward to act as skirmishers to prevent the Confederates from gaining the town quickly, and wrote a letter to John Reynolds, commanding the First Corps, to get up to Gettysburg as quickly as possible, which Reynolds would indeed do. So the next morning, the Iron Brigade found itself second in line behind Lysander Cutler's brigade, marching towards Gettysburg. Um, and they got there around just as John Buford uh, cavalry was beginning to break, and they deployed in the line of battles just below a little piece of high ground known as McPherson Ridge, or at least four of the regiments did. The 6th Wisconsin would be held in reserve for the time being, and we'll get into them in a minute because they're going to be important. So the Iron Brigade pushes forward into the woods on top of McPherson's Ridge, and as they do so, they encounter a brigade under uh, James J. Archer, made up of Tennesseans and Alabamians, deployed in those woods trying to move forward. And they're caught completely off guard, and Federals kind of outnumber them, and they're on the outside of the woods too, at least partially. And they charge forward and capture most of Archer's brigade, including Archer himself, um, in pretty rapid order. But not before John Reynolds is killed deploying or overseeing the deployment of the Iron Brigade forward. Um, yeah, and then Reynolds is killed, presumably by a sharpshooter. We don't know exactly how Reynolds died, despite what people say. Um, at around that same time, the 6th Wisconsin, which was held back, was ordered forward by Abner Doubleday because Joseph Davis's Mississippi and North Carolina brigade was moving through the field on the other side of the Chambersburg Pike, um, and was pushing back Lysander Cutler's brigade, and so they were moved to the flank of Cutler's brigade, and they got to a rail fence on the Chambersburg Pike and started delivering volleys to the 2nd Mississippi Infantry. And as they did so, they started receiving some pretty devastating volleys themselves. And so the commander of that regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, ordered the regiment over that fence line, and they charged into the 2nd Mississippi. And this kind of engaged a massive little brawl. Um, and in that brawl, similarly to what happened to Archer's brigade on the other side, 2nd Mississippi, swords of prisoners were taken in, and there was a very famous fight for the colors of the 2nd Mississippi. The flag bearer of the 2nd Mississippi, Private W. Murphy, or Sergeant W. Murphy, got into a little scuffle with Sergeant Francis Waller of the 6th Wisconsin over the flag of the 2nd Mississippi, and it's a little brawl there. But eventually, Waller overtook Murphy and was able to capture the flag as well as Murphy itself. So that was the first part of their action at Gettysburg. The second part, after a bit of a lull occurred, and Waller would get the Medal of Honor for his actions there, by the way. But uh, the second part of the engagement here would be after that. Meredith reformed his line, and there was a bit of a lull as Heath Henry Heath commanding the division opposing him, began deploying his men into lines of battle on the other side of Willoughby Creek. Um, the brigades that would be facing the Iron Brigade in this little patch of woods known as the Herbst Woods on McPherson Ridge would be the brigade of James Johnston Pettigrew, mostly made up of North Carolinians, and the other brigade would have been John Brockenbrough's brigade of Virginians. Uh, that there was a key difference between the two of these brigades. Pettigrew's brigade happened to be the largest one in the entire Army of Northern Virginia, whereas Brockenbrough's brigade was one of the smallest. So there was a bit of a size issue there. Pettigrew's brigade entered the Herbst Woods, and as soon as they crossed Willoughby Creek, came under a heavy fire from the um, Iron Brigade deployed in those woods. And one regiment in particular, the 26th North Carolina, led by a man named Henry Burgwin, would march into the woods facing the 24th Michigan Infantry. And this is a famous sort of action here in these woods, the 26th North Carolina, for just about as they crossed Willoughby Creek, they had already lost 4 of their color bearers. And there's a famous quote from Lieutenant Colonel of the regiment that nobody may touch those colors and live. And he said that after Burgwin himself picked up the flag. And as soon as he did, he was shot down. And he was the youngest colonel in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. He was 21 years old. Henry Burgwin. So quite a tragedy there. But they went into those woods against the 24th Michigan, and it was a deadly little battle in those woods. They fired and fired and fired so much to the point that the muskets were physically too hot to hold anymore, and that they were running out of ammo. It wasn't until the 26th North Carolina kind of rushed in, charged, that they kind of outflanked the 24th Michigan, and the other regiments of the Iron Brigade kind of started giving way because they were being outflanked by Brockenbrough's brigade that was coming in on the other flank. And so they fell back to Seminary Ridge, and when they did, by the point they did, they were still being pressed heavily, and they were still under heavy fire. Eventually, Meredith ordered brigade out to completely fall back with the rest of the army that was retreating at this point, full-scale retreat for the Army of the Potomac back towards the high ground beyond the town. And at the end of this engagement, because the Iron Brigade at this point was quite devastated. By this point, though, they had brought into the battle 1,800 men, 1,883 men. 671 were still alive, and I think I was confusing that with the numbers for 19 earlier, by the way. But only 671 of the 1,800 men that the Iron Brigade had originally were still present for duty following that engagement. So on July 2nd, the next day, because they didn't see any more combat on the first day of the battle, on July 2nd, they would be slightly engaged on Culp's Hill, but they were completely shattered. And this kind of is the end of the story for the Iron Brigade to some degree, as being what it was, right? This was the height of the Iron Brigade. Its most famous action was at Gettysburg in those woods there against especially against the 26th North Carolina and the 2nd Mississippi earlier that day. But they were completely devastated. I mean, for example, of the 496 men that the 24th Michigan had originally at the beginning of the battle, only 99 were present for duty on July 2nd. They were devastated. So immediately after Gettysburg, they were going to be reorganized. They had to be, and so a couple of regiments were added, or attempted to be. The one was the 167th Pennsylvania. And as soon as they were added to the regiment, of course, this brought a lot of scorn from the men of the regiment because, well, one, they weren't Midwesterners, and two, they were all draftees. And they also, the state of Wisconsin and Michigan tried adding draftees to those regiments. And, as typical, they they were not really accepted because they were not there at Gettysburg, and it was kind of viewed as if the men who were at Gettysburg were of a different creed, to some degree. They were of a different type.
Yeah, one of the best things you'll find on this idea of the draftee versus the volunteer is if you go and read Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed. If you get there towards the end, I can't remember if it is Pelelu when it starts. On one of the islands, they finally start getting draftees in there, and he writes one about how abysmal they were in tactics because they had not had any time, whether in actual training or in war, to become proficient at it and sort of thin the herd and leave the ones that were standing. None of that occurred, and so they're dropping fresh draftees in there. But then he also writes about the constitution of the men and how they viewed themselves in the various battles and as part of the Marines or the Army or whomever. And so it was very much a difference. Character is a little too strong to say that there was a difference in character, but certainly there was a difference in constitution and in desire of the men, not to mention the tactics and the ability of the fighting force. And that is something that you will see through various counts throughout history, amongst the various volunteers, not even necessarily the war chasers, but those who are willing to put themselves into a war prior to a draft, and then those who are conscripted or drafted in.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much none of the men who were present at Gettysburg, none of those men were draftees. And none of the men who initially signed up for the Iron Brigade, none of them were draftees. I mean, these were all volunteers, all men who came out from their homes and volunteered to fight for the Union. And of course, these men had a very different view of the draftees, because those draftees they didn't have that same desire to fight for the cause. They weren't there for the cause. They were there because they had to be there and they didn't want to be there. Whereas every man who originally enlisted, they were there because they wanted to be there, and they fought because they wanted to fight. And so those men had a very different, I guess, yeah, I guess a different constitution, a different, a different. They had a different way of carrying themselves, definitely, and they definitely performed better in combat. Draftees, so much, especially in the Civil War, and from what I've read, a lot about the draftee regiments, and they didn't perform that well at all. They did quite abysmally. The draft, I think, overall in the Civil War was a massive failure. If anything, caused more problems for the Union than it helped anything.
That's sort of the story throughout history, but I would be very curious to go and look at the performance of Anglo draftees in comparison to Persian draftees or Ethiopian draftees or whomever. I'm curious if there's trends between those that have a quality volunteer martial force in comparison to their draftee force, or if all draftees in general just kind of suck. I don't know. That sort of popped in my mind as you're talking about it.
I mean, there were some draftees who the men of the Iron Brigade would write about, who proved themselves well regardless,
Yes.
uh, during the Overland campaign specifically. Now, and that's I don't want to. go too much into the Overland Campaign because it's kind of a bad time for the Iron Brigade. They go in around May of 1864. I mean, their ranks have been gutted by this point, and at that point in time, Grant was preparing for his Overland campaign. And they received a new permanent regiment. The 167th was a 9-month regiment that was kicked out of the brigade because of bad conduct. But they received a new permanent regiment, actually two. The they received a New York sharpshooter regiment, and then they received the 7th Indiana Infantry. And they didn't quite like the 7th Indiana, and they didn't consider them part of the Iron Brigade. Again, because they weren't at Gettysburg, and that's kind of the big thing is that the what was considered to be by this point what the Iron Brigade was the men that were at Gettysburg. Um, so the
Yeah, absolutely. That was the high point. That was the high point of, I believe it was the high point of enrollment, but certainly it was the high point of valor and of impact
oh
amidst the
yeah,
war.
yeah, that, and I mean Antietam as well for them. I mean those I think
Yes.
Antietam and in Gettysburg were the two defining moments for them, the two famous moments for them. It's kind of like how you have for the Irish Brigade, Antietam, the Sunken Road, and Fredericksburg and Mary's Heights for them, being their two like defining moments of valor and bravery. Um, you have for them, for the Iron Brigade, it was Gettysburg and the 7th Indiana. Well, they weren't there for it. At least they weren't part of the Iron Brigade for it. So, as you can see there on that graphic you pulled up, you notice the 7th Indiana isn't included in that because again they were out afterwards. But yeah, during the Overland Campaign, their last kind of heroic battle was at the Wilderness, where they made a charge across Saunders Field into a patch of woods and drove the Confederates back a bit, but then they were driven out, and they suffered pretty bad casualties at the Wilderness. Um, and so this kind of leads us to kind of what I'll consider the final chapter of the Iron Brigade, and that's at the Battle of North Anna. And at the Battle of North Anna, they were part of the Fifth Corps because the First Corps suffered so many casualties at Gettysburg. They were incorporated into the Fifth Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And at the Battle of North Anna, the Iron Brigade made a charge across the river, across a pontoon bridge, and almost immediately after they did, they were hit by Confederate infantry. And for the first time in its history, the Iron Brigade shattered. It broke completely, and the men essentially completely ran. They ran, and a lot of them jumped into the North Anna and swam across, or tried to. And it was a quite humiliating moment. It was kind of after that. Um, it was the first time and the only time really that the Iron Brigade broke like that. But because of just the amount of casualties and how they'd been used, especially in the beginning of the Overland Campaign, because of the amount of casualties they had sustained throughout the war, they just couldn't take it anymore, right? So um, that
Yeah,
was
well,
what.
and just to repeat, because I know you guys have heard this, and so guys that caught it, I apologize, but I'm going to repeat. There were particular units within the brigade that lost three-quarters of their fighting men.
Yeah,
So some of them, and that's not simply, I mean, not to be crass, but that's not simply enlisted, but that's including officers as well. And so the whole command structure had to be redone, not to mention the morale of various units.
I mean,
Um,
yeah. Edward Bragg was commanding the brigade by this point, and I mean, these regiments had just suffered so many casualties, and they're the regimental commanders. I think at least two regimental commanders of the Iron Brigade were killed at Gettysburg.
Yeah,
Um,
Gettysburg was absolutely devastating, and not simply for the reasons already mentioned, but the Iron Brigade's high water mark had already passed, and these were guys who to pull it together. It's no wonder that for them the Iron Brigade had already ended. Now you've got guys from New York and Pennsylvania coming in. You've got draftees rather than volunteers, and so this is it is a group in name only at this point.
oh yeah, and that's another thing I'll say about that. By this point, I don't know how many veterans were even left of the brigade. I'm guessing by this point, most of them were the draftees, and that most of the because the Union Army um, at this point was enlisting so many draftees. I imagine that most of them, because like I said, the 24th Michigan at Gettysburg, they had 400 men, almost 500 men, starting the battle, and at the end of it, they had 99. So you can imagine most of the regiment by that point was probably made up of new volunteers and draftees.
100%.
So um, yeah, I think it's hard to say that that was the Iron Brigade that made that attack across North Anna. That it was more a new brigade that kind of wore the old uniforms and adopted the old name with some of the
Yeah,
old veterans. But
which can happen. I mean, that can happen, but it's yeah, you start playing a dangerous game as an officer. Anyways, I'm getting into the weeds. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I think well, and after this, the Iron Brigade for the most part kind of slowly dissolved itself. It wouldn't it wouldn't be the same, obviously. At After North Anna, the brigade did see action at Cold Harbor, but slowly the regiments of the Iron Brigade were kind of phased out. I think just after the Overland Campaign, the 24th Michigan was taken completely out of service and sent up to Washington D.C. for some kind of presidential guard duty. They couldn't see any more combat. They were completely shot through. The 19th Indiana was mustered out of service in October of 1864. So a couple of the Wisconsin regiments remained, but most of them were mustered out. So that was kind of the end of the Iron Brigade for the most part. Some of those men, actually, most of the old volunteers, probably did re-enlist, but not under the old regiments. So they would have been enlisted in new regiments. So that
Sure.
that was kind of it. But
So, what any big names that either lasted to the end or that post Gettysburg that we would see crop up later in the Seventh Cavalry or in various fights headed out west?
well, definitely John Gibbon. He would actually rise to a corps commander during the war, and he had several prominent commands throughout the war. Um, After the war, he was out west fighting the Indians. Um, Edward Bragg would I think later get a division command, I believe. Um, Solomon Meredith, who commanded the brigade at Gettysburg, he was severely wounded at Gettysburg, and he after that uh, was essentially forced to a desk position. He was incapable physically of bleeding. And I think actually, to be fair to Meredith, despite what Gibbon and Doubleday thought about him, he definitely proved himself at Gettysburg not to have been the coward that he was kind of touted to be after Antietam. So that I think settles all that with Meredith. I think Meredith was a plenty courageous man. Um, who else to think of? Most of these men of the Iron Brigade after the war. Um, I can speak of a couple of the ones that I know from here who were buried here. There's two, and both of them, like I said, were wounded at Gettysburg. And one of them is a sergeant He after being wounded at Gettysburg, he was wounded severely in the arm. He was put into the invalids and served as a guard at Elmira prison camp during for the rest of the war. After the war, he went home and he lived with the scars and in horrible pain for pretty much the rest of his life. Um, and so, I mean, I guess that's kind of what a lot of them ended up. I mean, I guess that's the red badge of courage that a lot of them ended up living with for the rest of their life. Um,
So here's one for you: the Iron Brigade. We've just done a whole stream on it, so it's not that they're unknown. Certainly for people that dig into the war and are aficionados of that, they are aware of the Iron Brigade. However, outside of guys who take interest in this area, it seems like they're not particularly well known. They're not Chamberlain, they're not Grant, they're not, let alone Lee or any part of the Confederacy. Do you think I'm overstating how little legend they carry, or do you think that's a fair point, and what do you think causes that?
okay, I would say even the Irish Brigade seems to overshadow them for some reason in modern interpretations and histories of the war. Even the Stonewall Brigade, which I would consider the Stonewall Brigade to be essentially the Iron Brigade's equal on the Confederate side, even they overtake. Probably because of the fame of their old commander. Of course, the Iron Brigade, they had John Gibbon, who did rise to fame during the war outside of the Iron Brigade as a corps commander and a division commander, but he isn't Stonewall Jackson. Um,
Right.
so I guess that might be why the Stonewall Brigade gets that. But yeah, I think in modern perceptions of history, yeah, I don't think the Iron Brigade is particularly famous. Maybe it's because also they never received like a they're only showing in well they're yeah I think they're only showing in any movie, even Civil War movies would be the movie Gettysburg, and even then it's a very short little clip. It's not long. Uh, it's and it actually associates the Iron Brigade with a particular song, "Hell on the Wabash," which, to be fair, it was not the song that the Iron Brigade went into battle listening to at Gettysburg. It was actually the camp bells are coming. It's a little inaccuracy about the movie Gettysburg. I love the movie Gettysburg. I'm not saying anything bad about it, but the movie Gettysburg props up Chamberlain and the actions of the 20th Maine, and I think I might want to get into that a little bit too, as being like a huge thing in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I can tell you, for the men in the Herbst Woods, and if anybody could see the fighting in the Herbst Woods and compare it to what happened on Little Round Top against the 20th Maine, the fighting in the Herbst Woods was far more devastating. And that isn't to say anything bad about the 20th Maine or discount their service or anything to that degree, but it is to say, of all the intense fights at Gettysburg, to kind of only give it a few seconds in the movie, and it's not even their most famous action. The action that is shown in the movie Gettysburg of the Iron Brigade is they're going into the woods on McPherson Ridge and facing Archer's Brigade, which was very early in the battle. It doesn't even depict the fight later on in the Herbst Woods against especially the 24th Michigan and the 26th North Carolina. The boy colonel, that poor young man, Henry Berglund, who was killed carrying the flag of the North Carolina Regiment, or the you know nearly 73% casualties that the 24th Michigan sustained in those woods. Again, firing and their muskets becoming too hot to even hold from the amount of fire that they're putting down, and the woods just being filled with smoke and bodies everywhere. It was
Which is almost that whole idea of muskets becoming too hot to fire. That is an insane concept, because of the length of time it takes to load and refire.
Yeah, and it wasn't the first time they had that happen to them, though. I mean, that
Yeah.
same thing had happened when they made the stand on the National Road at South Mountain. Their muskets were also, in that case, too hot to hold to some degree, and then
Yeah.
they had to slacken their fire. Uh, so that's how much these men, and the fact that they didn't break, because most
Yes.
regiments would have broken under those circumstances after sustaining 100, 200 losses in those woods. They would have pulled back, but these men did not. They stood there and they stood firm, and they did not budge.
It. Oh man. Even now in today's settings where it is so unlikely for this to happen, but there's whispers in the back of your head when you're in the infantry of how awful a battle of attrition can be. And I couldn't even tell you. I think the last one we went through was maybe uh, Okinawa.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, somewhere in the island hopping campaign seems like it would have been the last no joke battle of attrition that we've been through. No, 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 no. I'm sorry. Maybe chosen. I'm not sure. I would have to actually get in and compare numbers. But the one that's popping out in my head right now is Okinawa. So
Yeah, I think that might be the closest one, maybe. But
yeah,
it was just such a devastating little battle, and to only give it a couple of minutes in the movie, I think is a little bit underselling it. And I think in popular
yeah,
culture, people think of the Iron Brigade, but I think it's overshadowed by other brigades, perhaps unfairly. Because again, I mean, these guys were probably the best men in the Army of the Potomac in terms of fighting quality.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I wonder what causes that. Who knows?
They weren't the only famous Midwestern brigade, though. There was one other one, the Michigan Brigade,
Okay.
Custer's Brigade,
Yes.
famously. But they were cavalrymen. Um,
It's funny. It's funny to think though too that um, for me it makes me laugh the whole idea of Michigan men being led by an Ohio man.
oh yeah, but I mean, he considered himself a Michigander, though. You know,
Yeah.
he was born in Ohio, but lived most of his early life in Monroe, Michigan,
Right.
um, where there's a monument to him. But the Iron Brigade has a few monuments to it, of course, on the battlefields and here in Michigan. But I guess I especially feel a connection to the Iron Brigade because I see I can go to local cemeteries and I see men of those regiments
So that
specifically.
was going to be my next question for you is, what is the lasting legacy in Indiana, in Michigan, in Wisconsin?
I think we're probably the people who remember them the most. I don't
Yeah.
think most people outside of this area of the country really, especially in popular, but that's the thing. I think it's just a general thing about the Civil War is that
Hmm.
I think most people just don't really. They're so detached from it, and the way they view it is, oh, I mean, it's just a bunch of men, taking turns shooting at each other in a field, and that's kind of what
Right.
their perception of the Civil War is, and they don't.
Well, it's that, and it's that, Mr. George Custer was going to free the slaves because that's what he had been
Oh,
born to
those
do.
men, yeah, those men. Yeah, John Gibbon definitely was
Right.
not any kind of abolitionist. Actually, I was going to get into a story about John Gibbon
Please. Yes.
because after the war, there's a little story that I read in Confederate Veteran magazine where he went with a former Confederate veteran farming down south in North Carolina. And it just so happened that he was farming on somebody else's property that he wasn't supposed to be on. Um, and well, the Confederate veteran that he was with apparently I think knew the property owner and knew he was who he was, but that property owner came out with a gun and those two hunters on the property said, "Who are you, and what are you doing on my property? So you're poaching on my property." And he said, "Well, would you believe it if I told you that I have here your old brigade commander? You mean John Gibbon?" He's, "Yeah." It's like, "No, I wouldn't believe you. You better show him to me." And he brought out John Gibbon from the woods, and it was a goofy little story. But and he's like, "Okay, you can hunt here as long as you feel you want to. My property is your property. You're welcome here as long as you want."
Yeah.
So that's a funny little anecdote about John Gibbon. He's an interesting character. Definitely worth reading about. And
Well, yeah, go for it.
if I'd say if you're interested in the Iron Brigade and its history, there's a couple of good books on it. The first one I would definitely recommend is A Brotherhood of Valor, The Common Soldiers of the Stonewall Brigade and the Iron Brigade, by Jeffrey D. Wirt, which goes over both brigades and kind of compares the two in their famous actions. And well, actually, how I said the Iron Brigade kind of collapsed at the Battle of North Anna. Well, the Stonewall Brigade, just a few days previous, had suffered a very similar fate when most of the Stonewall Brigade was actually killed or captured at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse at the apex of the Mule Shoot. So both of those famous brigades ended up kind of dissolving during the Overland Campaign. The other one is The Iron Brigade, A Military History by Alan T. Nolan. This is a bit of an older one, I think, but both of these are very good books. And I would definitely recommend them if you're interested in this topic a little more, in these famous regiments and brigades of the war.
All right, I think I found that second one. Let me bring it up.
Yep, that would be the one.
Okay, so Alan Nolan on this second one. All right, well, perfect. Anything else before we put a bow on this one?
I would say I think I've said about all I need to. I enjoyed talking here. It's definitely been a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so this was great. Of course, I'm biased. I'm a Great Lakes kid, and so this caught my eye, and I wanted to bring attention to it, dig into it some. It was fun as well because it seems to be one of the lesser known for whatever reason, as we've just discussed over the past few minutes. For whatever reason, one of the lesser known portions, excuse me, portions of military history, particularly within the Civil War. So that having been said, Mr. Blue and Butternut, this was great. Where can people find you, and what sort of content can they get excited for?
Well, mainly find me on Twitter, at Blue and Gray 1864. I talk a lot about the Civil War. I have a Substack, which is linked from there. This year, I plan on doing some stuff for the Great Sioux War out west, and some stuff relating to some of the 1863 campaigns, particularly Gettysburg again. Um, yeah, I've just been quite busy. I haven't been able to get much stuff out on my page recently. I've been very, very busy with my personal life. But yeah, that and Discord. You can find me on there. Where is it? My Discord is Blue and Gray 1864. Just like the same Twitter, same as my Twitter handle. So if you're interested in contacting me, that would be the place to do so.
Yep, absolutely. And then I have his X profile. The link is there in the description. Again, Blue and Gray 1864, and jump on there, especially if the War of Northern Aggression, the U.S. Civil War, interests you at all. Having said that, hey, I appreciate the stream, brother. Next week, I believe we'll be getting into some medieval issues, including, what is the medieval mindset, and then some of the foundational Foundational literature, foundational explanations of the written word, and so how we can approach that. So, having said that, gentlemen, I appreciate you viewing and look forward to seeing you all later. Have a good evening.